Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. I recognize that some of you are still sampling the dessert bar here and may want to continue to sample until midnight, but we will start our program, and we are delighted to have as our keynote conference speaker tonight His Excellency Samir Sumaida'ie. He was appointed Iraqi's ambassador to the United States in April of 2006. Prior to this appointment, he served as Iraq's permanent representative to the United Nations from July 2004 until April of 2006. And before that, he served as Minister of Interior in Baghdad. As Minister of Interior, he managed a domestic security force of over 120,000 and made considerable progress in reorganizing and modernizing the ministry's operations. In addition, the ambassador served as a member of the Governing Council in Iraq, where he was chairman of the Media Committee. He played an integral role in founding the Iraqi Telecoms and Media Commission and the Public Broadcasting Institution. He also held positions on the Security, Finance, and Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to removal of the Ba'athist regime, the ambassador was actively involved in opposition efforts in the United Kingdom and attended a number of high-level conferences throughout the world in furtherance of that. As founding member of the Association of Iraqi Democrats and the Democratic Party of Iraq, he is widely renowned as an expert on the political climate of Iraq. A successful businessman, Ambassador Sumaida'ie founded a procurement agency in 1978 and has embarked on a number of entrepreneurial ventures in his career. In the 1980s, he established a design office in London, pioneered the use of computers in Islamic art, and completed important works in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and the United Kingdom. Most recently, he served as co-founder and managing director of China Business International, an investment consultancy and procurement company based in Beijing. The ambassador was born in Baghdad and resided there until 1960. He graduated from Durham University. Matter of fact, we were commenting on the way in from the airport that he has finally come to Durham again, albeit a few miles from where you were graduated. He graduated in 1965 with a degree of electrical engineering. He then returned to Iraq to work with the Baghdad Electricity Board and the Iraqi Petroleum Company before leaving the country in 1973. The ambassador is married and has 5 children, all of whom currently reside in the United Kingdom. He enjoys a wide range of cultural activities, including writing poetry and crafting designs in Islamic decorative medium. And I would encourage you, if you have not done so, to go on the Iraqi website and you will see some of his work, which Balfour Smith has already checked out and given it the highest marks. So he is a gifted artist as well as a gifted diplomat. You might know, if you have been checking your computers, that there is an excellent op-ed today in the Wall Street Journal that is authored by our speaker tonight. So it is a great privilege to welcome to the podium the Iraqi ambassador to the United States. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's always with trepidation that I approach speaking to experts, particularly legal experts. I am not a lawyer, and some of the things that I will say this evening might not be totally well received, but I will say them anyway because that's my way. I'm not a career diplomat, so I don't wrap the things I say in a lot of diplomatic language. This evening, I hope to shed some light on the situation in Iraq to help create perhaps better insights and understanding of why we are all in this mess, all together, Iraqis and Americans, and what are the prospects of us getting out of it. Let me first take you on a trip in history. Everyone knows that Iraq and Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization. What does that mean? It's a cliche. When you know that Iraq, or in Iraq, was the first settled urban society, the first town and the first city, the first government, the first laws, the first time writing was used, was invented and used as a store and repository of human knowledge, the first organized school, the first religions, and I can go on. A lot of the things that we take for granted started in my country. The concept of a week as a unit of time, it was first used by the Babylonian. I don't want to spend the whole evening, because I could, telling you about what the modern world owes the people of Mesopotamia, the people of Iraq, which incidentally comes from Uruk, which was one of the first city-states in history. We have contributed a great deal, not least the brewing of beer for those who like beer. But history did not treat us well, because Iraq represented in the ancient times a center of wealth and learning. It was at the same time an object of desire by conquering empires and conquering rulers. And Iraq was, for many, many centuries, indeed for thousands of years, a battleground. For that reason, Iraqis have honed the art of survival. They are the most resilient and resourceful people I know. The good is very good, and the bad is very bad. So I speak with a combination of pride and sorrow, because we have suffered as a result of our history. Yet we have so much potential that we can make out of our country a wonderful place to live in. I was born in Baghdad, into a middle-class family, not very rich, not too poor. My parents took care of my education like so many other parents. I went to good government schools. I had high marks. The government sent me on to study in the UK on a scholarship paid for by the government. At that time, I remember, we didn't have any security problems. Crime was very low. It was social harmony. There was no question of who is Sunni, who is Shia, who is Christian, who is Jew. Iraq was an up and coming place. It was pioneering in the arts, in the sciences. Our schools were the best in the region. Women in Iraq were ahead of where they were in our neighboring countries. The first woman graduate in Iraq graduated from law school in 1935, at a time when our neighbors did not send their girls to primary schools. They did not have schools for their girls. We had the first woman minister in 1959. The first woman judge, 1938. Iraq had a thriving economy thanks to the oil. And by the time we fell into dictatorship after the 1958 revolution, Iraq had foreign exchange reserves of something like $35 billion, which was a tidy sum at that time. The GDP of Iraq was equivalent to that of Spain. So Iraq was definitely an up-and-coming country. What happened? Military rule, which slid into dictatorship, which then metamorphosed into absolute dictatorship in 1979. 2 wars later, Iraq was on its knees. 2 wars and a decade and a half of sanctions, I must add, because they took their toll. At the end, when all that was done, when the Americans intervened, Iraq was a wreck. When the monarchy ended in 1958, let's say 60, the Iraqi dinar was worth 3.3 American dollars. When Saddam was removed, a dollar was worth more than 3,000 Iraqi dinars. Instead of $35 billion of reserves, we had liabilities to the tune of more than $350 billion. About 120 billion of actual debts, and the rest are potential reparations, which could even be more. And on and on. The health system was in Iraq, the educational system was completely destroyed, and the level and quality of education was extremely bad. The very social fabric had almost disintegrated. In fact, up till the time of the sanctions, up till 1998, the institutions of the state that were inherited from the 50s and 60s were more or less still intact. But the sanctions made sure that they were completely ruined. Corruption became endemic because people had to survive. When a teacher gets $4, $5, $10 a month, he absolutely has to levy payments from the children's parents. When an official gets similar amount, he has to survive, and so on. So the sanctions were very, very destructive to not only to the institutions, but even the social fabric of the country. It's because of them that corruption became so endemic and ingrained. Then we come to the liberation. I, amongst many others, were coming to Washington and New York, lobbying for American intervention in Iraq, begging for American intervention in Iraq. We wanted help from outside because we realized that the regime in Baghdad was so powerful, so fully in control, so ruthless, that there was really no possibility of any action against it from within. People who were talking about that were simply uninformed or just dreaming. Our only hope was foreign intervention. So we lobbied, we tried our best. In the early 90s, some people listened to us politely. We got sometimes tea and sympathy, but that's all. In the 1996, 1997, People didn't even want to receive us and listen to us. And at that time, the policy in place was containment. Keep the lid on and let it fester. Forget about it. It's nothing to do with us. So we were beating our heads against a brick wall. All this changed after 9/11. Containment gave way to regime change. And you know the sequence of events which led to American intervention in Iraq. We welcomed the American intervention, as did the bulk of the Iraqi people. Because to us, it was a godsend. To us, we saw the Americans as saviors. They indeed were. And to this day, we are grateful for the intervention. However, I must say, in all frankness and honesty, it was not managed well. There was not enough understanding of what the United States was getting into. We tried to help this understanding. In the 6 months prior to March 2003, several groups were formed. Many Iraqis worked with American officials to develop plans for post-Saddam. There were about 10, 15 working groups. There was one on the economy, one on security, one on tribal affairs, one on cultural affairs, and so on and so forth. One on the constitution, one on... There were many groups. Well-informed, well-educated Iraqis tried to explain what needed to be done. But unfortunately, all that was shelved, put aside, and not applied. The biggest error was the fact that there was not a big enough force to maintain law and order. The loss of law and order created an atmosphere of lawlessness that we're still trying to recover from. And you know the scenes of looting, and you know the tragedy of the looting of the Iraqi museum, and I don't have to go into great details about that. Then you all know about the disbanding of the army, but not too many people talk about the disbanding of the police or the effective disbanding of the police. During Saddam, the security forces were the main and the only standing institutions in the country. In some towns, more than 50% of the working population was engaged in security-related affairs. So the only thing that was standing up was security. Now, security, however, was not only security of the regime. It was not only organizations concerned with the preservation and survival of the regime. There were several departments, such as department in the police, which is countering drug smuggling, another one organized crime, another one on counter espionage, another one, and so on. We had specialist departments. And a country without such expertise, without such professional capacity, is open to and vulnerable to massive crime. Saddam, just before he fell, released all the hardened criminals in prisons, released them to the streets. And to make this picture more complete, you have to realize that after these wars and the sanctions, crime was rife. A whole generation of young people knew nothing except fighting. They survived 2 wars, those who survived, witnessing so many of their comrades dying next to them, full of anger, had no skills, and the only thing they knew was violence and aggression. Now, it was in this environment, that Iraq was plunged into lawlessness without the protection of any safety network to protect the ordinary communities, ordinary citizens, people. And you know the results. Very quickly, the insurgency started. Al-Qaeda was imported into Iraq. I myself crossed the border from Jordan to Iraq in a car with a friend of mine. It was his car. It was a big Mercedes. We passed the Jordanian checkpoint. We came to the Iraqi side looking for somebody to welcome us, stamp a passport, look at us, say hello. No one. Totally no one. It was an American armored vehicle a few hundred yards off the road. We drove up to it. I got off. I went to the American soldier, shook him by the hand, say, thank you, we are glad you are here. Drove the car back and headed to Baghdad. On the way, we were stopped by bandits who wanted to rob us or kill us or kidnap us, or I don't know, at that time we didn't know what they really wanted. But they looked like they are sort of from that Anbar area. So I talked to this guy who had his face covered in the local dialect and said to him, you should be ashamed of yourself. I am a Sayyid from this area. How dare you? I am from a family which is well known in that area. And when he recognized that, he just said, sorry, Sayyid, and closed the door. I couldn't believe it. We drove to Baghdad. That incident brought home to me the reality that I was coming back to. I went back to Baghdad. It was a different city to the one I had left 26 years before. Totally different city. The people were different. Everything was different. I did not intend at that time to, really get involved into the public administration, but the vacuum was so great that all my colleagues and compatriots who were in the opposition were assuming roles, and I got involved, and here I am. But this is to give you a picture of what the Americans got into. Then the next major mistake was to declare the status of Iraq as an occupied country. This was a disaster because it cast us in the role of collaborator with the occupier and cast the terrorists and the insurgents in the role of freedom fighters. And we were told that this declaration was made on the basis of legal advice. And I'm sorry here to say this. Lawyers sometimes can make mistakes, just in case you don't know. It was a disaster. The media in the Arab world seized on this. The media of Al-Qaeda seized on this. And to this day, we cannot remove the stain. We cannot remove the stigma. We're still fighting this label of occupation. It might have been a convenient legal basis for the operation of the CPA at the time, but the political consequences were and are disastrous for both Iraqis and Americans. Then we were rushed into elections too early. The country was not ready, passions still inflamed, tension is still great, grievances and wounds too raw. But we were bundled into elections because they want to make us democratic, quickly. Well, another disaster. In the volatile environment that I described, what could be the result of elections? Precisely the situation we have now. A dysfunctional parliament and a dysfunctional government. Then we come to the media. When I say we, Iraqis who were fighting Saddam for decades, who were happy to have the Americans come in and save us. We were desperate to get the message to the rest of the people, to the people who knew it, but we were fighting the counter arguments of the Saddamists, who had a very well-oiled propaganda machine, and the media of the surrounding countries. And we were begging for a means to do it. Along with other institutions, the Ministry of Information, which had the studios and the cameramen and the reporters and the professional media people, although of course it was in the service of the regime, but the facilities were the broadcasting facilities, the hardware, the software, everything was, all of that was disbanded, looted, and we were left talking to ourselves. We wanted to address our people, we could not. A contract was awarded in Washington to a company in Washington to create an organization for some broadcasting in Iraq with no reference to content. They were paid by the acre, the acreage they cover, about 100 million, and all they ended up, after putting together some equipment, broadcasting cookery courses of Tunisian dishes or some ridiculous thing at a time when our people and your boys were being killed. And it was frustrating for us. At the end of 1 year of that contract, at that point, we knew that President Bush was frustrated, Tony Blair was frustrated, we were desperate. Jerry Bremer was angry. We, of course, were hoping that that would be fixed. Suddenly, we learned through the media that another contract was awarded to the Harris Corporation in place of the SAIC Corporation. Another $96 million, which was then part subcontracted to LBC in the Lebanese. And the same thing repeated itself. We lost the initiative. We had, by that time, lost the public information war. With all this, it's not surprising to see why we are in the mess that we are. However, to avoid making the picture totally black, there are many bright aspects to it. The bright aspect, the biggest bright aspect, is that the Americans ultimately always learn from their mistakes. I think it was Winston Churchill who said, Americans always end up doing the right thing after exhausting the alternatives. And they did learn. In January last year, they made the first really significant change, which resulted in the transformation of the situation. That was the time when the surge was announced, General Petraeus was put in place, and counterinsurgency principles were applied instead of force protection as a doctrine, which was a defensive attitude where American forces are entrenched in their bases and they rush from one base to another, expecting fully to be attacked on the way. They had ceded territory to terrorists who were intimidating the local communities anyway. The whole approach changed to seizing territory, working with the local communities, securing the local communities, and making sure that, that no territory is left as a safe haven to the terrorists. That was the catalyst which encouraged people in Al-Anbar to turn against Al-Qaeda And because Iraqis are not extremists, they are not violent. There are some who are, but the bulk of the community are just like you and me, just want to live and get on and get their children to school and live a productive life. So that was a major shift. And that started to produce positive results, and positive results create a feedback loop. And instead of a year and a half ago when we were on a downward spiral, we are now definitely on an upward spiral. Maybe not very steep, but definitely an upward spiral. There were, again, some simplistic proposals here in Washington, here, nearby in Washington, that, Iraq is made up of Sunnis, Shi'i, and Kurds. Everybody knows that, right? And the way to sort it out is to just create three parts. One for the Sunnis, one for the Shia, one for the Kurds. And everybody is happy. It's not like that. More than 1/3 of the people in towns and cities are born of mixed marriages. There are Shia towns in Sunni areas, Sunni towns in Shia areas. There are more Kurds in Baghdad than in any city in Kurdistan. There are umpteen other minorities, from the Turkmen to the Yazidis to the Assyrian Christians. If we start putting them in ghettos and separating them, Iraq cannot be separated. Iraq is the product of thousands of years of living side by side. We are used to this life and cannot be separated. And now, and the one thing that unified Iraqis, everybody's at everybody's throat now in a time of turmoil, of course, there's a lot of tension and there's a lot of violence. But when these schemes started coming out of Washington, everybody united against them, which is a very telling fact. So we believe that Iraqis themselves can eventually, once the stresses and strains of their circumstances are reduced, they can reach accommodations, and they're beginning to. There are other challenges, as if I didn't enumerate enough of them, as of the corruption, the money management. The United States spent billions upon billions of dollars of taxpayers' money, hard-earned taxpayers' money. But they were not so effective, a lot of them, because they would give big contracts to big companies American companies, who then subcontract them at a much reduced price to a Kuwaiti or a Jordanian company, which then subcontracts that further to some entity in Iraq, which then subcontracts them down to local operators who go with a bucket of paint, and you get nothing at the end of it. A lot, I'm exaggerating deliberately, but to make a point. A lot of money was spent, but not effective. We have challenges of our regional forces. The relationship between the United States and Iran has been festering for decades. And whilst Iran was relieved to have Saddam removed, they were not delighted to have American forces at their doorstep. And of course, it was very much, and still is, in their interest to frustrate and embarrass the Americans and ensure they fail in Iran. As a result, we get, of course, the pressure on us in Iran. Our Arab neighbors who have their own phobias about Shia, about Iran, again, they look at us with great suspicion. And initially, they were in denial after the removal of Saddam, and now they are in two minds as what to do, and mostly inactive, and they should be more active. So Turkey has problems with the Kurds. So we have pressures from our neighbors, which further complicate our lives. But I still come back to say Iraqis are very resourceful. They are extremely resilient. I know members of parliament now in Iraq. One in particular, Mithal Alusi, this one prominent member. His 3 sons were murdered by terrorists. And I know him. The thought of quitting never crossed his mind. I know that for a fact. And there are many people like him. We are tough people. And I believe this inner toughness, together with the real nature of goodness and also toughness of the American people, eventually will achieve the right results. Americans don't like to lose. And especially not to the people who bombed them on 9/11. I think that determination, that steely determination eventually will see us through, despite all the challenges that I outlined. How do we progress from here? We're not going to suddenly be transformed into a society which is, I'm sorry if I've taken too long, but I'll just finish very soon. We're not going to be suddenly transformed into a tranquil and prosperous society. This will happen over time, slowly, incrementally, but surely. We will have setbacks. It will be hard. It will be costly. But I have no doubt in my mind that we will make it. And I have no doubt, no matter who is going to win the White House, by the way. And I'm not going to get involved in American politics here. But I feel convinced that all the 3 candidates now for the presidency, all of them, are patriotic Americans who will put the national interest of the United States uppermost when they get there and assume their responsibility. And they will look at the facts and the realities and weigh up the choices, and I think the only choice is to succeed here. Well, of course, different people will have different definitions of success. But at least they will not go along with anything that will be total defeat and failure. The rest we will take care of. Before I finish, since this conference is about terrorism, I wanted to say a few things about it. I took part in a conference about terrorism in Texas last year. At that time, I had the time to actually to participate in the whole conference. I arrived here this afternoon just at the tail end of one of the sessions, and I'm sure you've had comprehensive discussions and you will have some more discussions. But what I'd like you to do is not only focus on how to treat the symptoms of terrorism, how to deal with the effects of terrorism, but to address your minds to the causes and prevention of terrorism. Terrorism is like a disease. It's a social disease. It's now an international disease. And if we only prescribe medicines for those who have been afflicted with it, we're never going to eradicate it. It's like malaria. You've got to think of the whole cycle of the disease and prepare measures to deal with every single stage. By the time a suicide bomber with explosives strapped around his waist is moving towards his target, it's already too late. You cannot do anything about it. In 99% of the cases, you cannot do anything about it. The smart thing to do is to stop him thinking about this, to stop the schools and the educational system and the parental guidance and the culture that breeds and the environment that breeds that phenomenon. And there is not, I feel there is not enough effort going into that. And also, as I heard during the brief time I listened to the discussion, I agree, this is not a problem that can be tackled by a single country. This is an international problem and requires a multinational, multilateral approach. And the proposal I made in the last conference was to try and push for an approach at the UN, where it is mandatory on every country. In the same way as we make it mandatory on civil rights issues, we have to make it mandatory on terrorism issues for countries to create legislations and instruments to prevent this phenomenon from arising. And media, we have to pay attention to the role of the media. We have now in the Arab world media which is insightful, media which glorifies the terrorist, media which spreads hate. Yet the Americans have a soft spot for what they call freedom of expression. Yeah, we love you for this. You're great. Freedom of expression is and should be sacred, but not the freedom to incite murder. There has to be a clear line. And if we have to err, we should think about the innocent victims and think of protecting them before thinking about the freedom of a lunatic to incite others to blow up innocent people. And I believe there has to be a shift in the approach to this problem and much less tolerance to media which peddles hate and violence. I've spoken for too long. Thank you for your forbearance.
The ambassadors agreed to take some questions or comments from you if you have any.
That's an easy ride.
Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned that there are lots of different definitions of success in Iraq. There was a lot of discussion on Capitol Hill this week with General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker about what were the kinds of conditions, what would Iraq look like at a time when it might be appropriate for the U.S. to begin to withdraw troops in a significant way. And I wonder if you have an image in your own mind. What will Iraq look like on that day?
First of all, it's not going to be a day. It's going to be a gradual process of reduction. Secondly, we will settle for the minimum. I was trained as an engineer, and I know the difference between a stable system and an unstable system. Those of you who have had this training. We need to have a state of affairs that is stable, where progress is being made towards reform and improvement, where we guarantee that we are on an upward spiral, not a downward spiral. As I said, we will take up the slack. We'll take it from there. We will do the rest. To ensure that we don't reverse the progress that we have made, and because of the pressures that I outlined from our neighbors, from the internal forces that I have also described, the institutions, the embryonic institutions that we have started would collapse. We need to just strengthen them enough for them to stand and continue. We have a long way to go. We have a lot of repair and maintenance and improvement to do. But we need to do them in an environment where we are sure that we are moving forward and not coming back. Yes, sir.
Considering the current state of affairs in Iraq, what do you think is the most important thing, or the first thing that we as Americans, or as the American military, or the American forces could do, and also the Iraqi people?
Well, there's a lot of things that Americans and the Iraqis can and should do, and are doing, by the way. The Americans are doing great now. They really are. They are in terms of security, in terms of engaging local communities, in terms of winning hearts and minds, creating projects, helping Iraqi institutions, helping government departments. They're doing a lot of good work. And as I said, this is a cumulative experience. And they've just now got into the rhythm of doing things right. And this is producing results, and the results are encouraging them to put in more effort. So I think the Americans are doing a lot. We also have to do a lot. We have to transform our own politics from a sectarian, Islamist, religious-based politics into issue-based politics. That's a tall order. It will take a while. But unless we reach that point, we will never have a stable country. There is realization, I think, in Iraq that this has to be done ultimately. We have to, above all, ensure the unity of the country and prevent it from disintegrating. At one point in 2006, there was a danger of civil war. That was averted. And if you look at my piece today in the Wall Street Journal, you will see the broad directions that I have suggested for the efforts from both sides. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Can you help us understand why the Iraqi government is running a significant budget surplus?
Yes, because they don't have any. It's a simplistic answer. I have, to illustrate this, I will go back to the year 2005, when a certain individual was in charge of the Ministry of Defense. He was given a large budget, and he pocketed most of it with his cronies. That was a disaster. Clearly, we can go and discuss why he was there, who put him in there, but that's academic to a large extent. The fact is that there were not enough controls to ensure that the money was spent in the proper way. Because the ministry had just been formed. Just you and you come and form a ministry. That set off a reaction. Ministers after that are given big budgets, but they're afraid to spend because they don't trust any of the people around them. There's no institutional continuity. The institutions are just being. This doesn't mean that we don't need to spend the money. It doesn't mean that we don't need the money. There's dire need at every level. If all the surplus we have is just spent on piping for clean water for the citizens of Iraq, it would not be enough. There's a huge need because there's nothing. But for us to spend this money and get results, it's not a question of burning it. We need to have institutions. And I think the Iraqi government should try to get some international help, some help in addition to its own resources. Americans are providing a great deal of this help, and I think that is now beginning to show results. We are beginning this year to spend, last year in 2007, we spent 60% of our budget. 2006, we spent 20%. So we're moving forward. In 2008, I hope we will spend more than the budget, or at least come closer to spending it fully. We are moving forward, but the reasons are, as I explained to you. Thank you.
I'm Lieutenant Lados of U.S. Navy. I started my career back doing the UN 986 resolution, doing boardings and inspections of Iraqi oil smuggling vessels. I saw at that point that the sanctions were definitely having an effect. You had mentioned sanctions earlier and the successes that they actually had that were perceived by many. I just wondering what you thought about the inevitable outcome would have been should those sanctions continue.
Well, creating a collapse in Iraq, but not the collapse of the regime. They were intended to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They in fact made him stronger relative to the people. So when the sanctions were applied, I and many of my compatriots in the Iraqi opposition were supportive of the idea. We wanted the sanctions to be applied. Very soon after we saw the effects, we became against. So sanctions are not an effective instrument for that purpose. We understand why they are attractive. They don't cost anything to apply, not much. They sound good. They sound as if they are real punishment. They're politically more palatable. But in the case of Iraq, they caused a lot of damage, I'm afraid, serious damage. Had Saddam been removed in 1991, we would not have had a fraction of the trouble that we've had now. Because at that time, society was still intact. Institutions of the state were more or less still intact. The country was able to function still. But at the end of the sanctions, all that had collapsed. Yes, sir.
One more question.
Thank you very much for your honest and eloquent presentation.
I hope this session was off the record.
Thank you, President. What were the arguments that you and your friends were making to try to convince the United States and other Western nations to enter Iraq for overthrow?
I tried every argument.
You name a few.
Yeah. After the 1991 intervention, our primary argument was that Iraq was the Iraqi regime was a destabilizing influence in the region. It was a threat to its neighbors, particularly to the Gulf, which was and still is the source of energy for the rest of the world. And it harbored ambitions of developing weapons of mass destruction, which it would not hesitate to use, because it actually used them on its own people in the north. So the primary argument was that Iraq, a violent and ruthless dictatorship, was a factor of instability, which is in nobody's interest to keep in place. That was the primary. Secondary and tertiary arguments was about human rights and the desperate state of the Iraqi people and so on.
Can I follow up on that?
Yes, please.
Were you convinced that the country did have weapons of mass production, either actually existing or in the works?
Well, it was proved to. There was at the beginning, and no. Let's take it step by step. In the early 90s, there was a program. It has been now revealed, and interestingly, it was only revealed when Saddam Hussein's son-in-law defected to Jordan, and suddenly, the Iraqi government officials remembered that they had this program, because they knew that Hussein Kamel had already taken with him documentation to prove that they had. So they had to reveal them. Then every time they reveal, they were forced to reveal a program or part of the program. They kept other parts hidden in the hope that they can revive them. This process continued incrementally until they actually had to give up everything. And at the end, stupidly, Saddam wanted to play the gamut of a threat without real weapons. He wanted to keep the impression that he had something hidden, when in fact he had been stripped of all he had. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, you began your comments by saying that you don't talk like a diplomat. You don't claim to be a diplomat. You don't come from that background, but I have a suggestion with all due respect. I think what you have said tonight has spoken as well for your people as anyone ever could. And for that, we thank you. We want to give you a little token gift so you will remember Duke in Durham in the United States, and to thank you for coming again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
This concludes our program for tonight. We will be starting back in the Janine Auditorium tomorrow morning at 8:45 to probe the issues involved in prosecution of terrorists in our federal courts, and then 2 other panels after that and luncheon presentations. So we hope you've enjoyed the evening. We hope you enjoyed the cuisine, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning. Good night.